my talk is about home food production as we have learned from data collected during the POSHAN community studies in Nepal. Many of you have seen this map. It's a nationally representative survey of sites across the mountains, the hills, and the terai of the country in 21 districts, 61 wards, and 5,000 to 6,000 families. And where I'm going to focus on right now is to address the question of how home food production may be affecting the frequency of intakes of nutritious foods by women, mothers of under 5-year-old children and young newlywed women, which comprise a very, a vulnerable member of the household when it comes to the choice and amount and adequacy of diets in a household. We had 21 teams. They carried out interviews with heads of households and mothers of young children. In addition to all the many variables that have been collected in this annual survey, the focus here is on the maternal 7-day food frequency that covered 43 different food items, frequency of intake during the past 7 days. The kinds of foods grown in 2 different seasons, focusing on the rainy season and the dry season, and the animals that are raised in the household for sale for food that would yield meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy products, and these kinds of foods over the past 12 months. So just for orientation, we are dealing with women who are generally thin. This is the prevalence of a low BMI below 18.5 in the mountains, hills, and terai of the country. Underweight being represented by less than 18.5. And you can see this is the terai prevalence, and then the mountains and the hills. So it's basically a thin population, especially in the terai, but there is a hint of overweight occurring as well that we should not ignore, and that becomes relevant to some of the data that I'm presenting. So these next slides are depicting the median and the interquartile range frequencies of intake in the past 7 days for dietary staples across the mountains, the hills, and the terai. The sample size is quite large in each ecological zone, agroecological zone. And I'm presenting here 2 groups of foods, the foods that we all know that people eat twice a day. And that is rice 14 times a week, potatoes 14 times a week, except in the hills a little bit less frequently, dal 14 times, or at least once a day, basically, and vegetable oil that has been gradually increasing, that is now 2 to 3 times a day in terms of servings. And then the lower part of this graph shows meat and poultry, dairy, eggs, fish, and the median intake frequency is about 1 time per week for meat and poultry, and varied between 0 and 1 time a week for dairy products. The median is 0 for eggs and fish, and you only see intakes at the upper 75th percentile and above in terms of the frequencies of intake. If we look at dark green leafy vegetables, in the mountains it's 3 times, 2 in the hills and the terai. And other carotenoid-rich fruits and vegetables is 0, except for the terai, which is 3. And that's driven by mangoes, because this survey was done in May through July, early August. So it's in the mango season, and we see it influencing the frequency of intake. Largely, other foods in this table are 0. Other vegetables that are not in that previous group, 2 to 3 times in the mountains and the hills, 7 in the terai, so once a day, other kinds of vegetables. And that's driven by gourds, which are grown on the rooftops and in the yards and the terai, very commonly done, as we know. The rest of these foods are 0 for a median intake per week. If we look at other fruits, Green, jackfruit, guava, orange, apple, pineapple, banana. Tomato is a fruit. It's 2 times in the mountains, 7 in the hills, 2 in the Terai. And in the hills, that 7 is largely driven by consumption of tomato. The rest of these foods, the median frequency nationally is 0. This is not unusual. We published a paper a few years ago from studies in Sarlai, in the NIPS study area in the Terai, and the conclusion was foods consumed regularly on a weekly basis were rice, potatoes, legumes, and vegetable oil. Animal products were 0 to 2 times per week. Vegetables that were nutritious were 0 times a week. So this is not an unusual finding. And so the question is, how does home food production, what role may that play in raising intakes above the national median? And so that's the cut point that I'm describing in these next few slides. And so, for example, for rice, the median is 14, and the question is, if they grow it or purchase it in these graphs, what is the influence on the risk of eating more than the national median? The numbers, and here's the number practicing, that is the number growing, the percentage growing rice and the percentage purchasing rice, and this is an odds ratio. So that's the odds of consuming more frequently than the national median, adjusted for a variety of things, the clustering of VDCs and wards, and the adjustment for household wealth quintile, maternal age, and adjusted for whether a household is grown or purchased. So grown and purchased are in the same models. And I've gone through that because the next several slides are exactly the same pattern, so we're trained to focus in on a couple of numbers. What we see here for rice, potato, and dal is odds ratios of around 1, basically. That is, these are the staples. If they don't grow it, they'll purchase it. If they don't purchase it, they'll grow it. They'll get it one way or the other. You haven't eaten unless you've had rice. And often some dal as well, and potato as well. So these are foods that are the staples, and they are obtained one way or the other. If we look at animal source foods in terms of grown or purchased in the household and how that influences the odds of women eating these foods more frequently than the national median, we get this kind of a table. So the median for dairy products nationally is 2 times per week. 27% of the households raise animals that give rise to dairy products. 57% will purchase those foods. The purchasing covers the past month. The diet is the past week. I failed to explain that. And if they do grow those foods at home, if they've grown those foods in the past year, then the women in those households are 5 times more likely to be consuming those foods. But the key factors I've put in red here, that if they grow those animals, that women are more likely to consume those foods. In terms of egg, the national median is 0 times per week. And they're 2.5 times more likely to consume those foods now, really at all, in the past week, if the chickens are grown in the household that yield those eggs. And they're more likely to eat chicken, and they're more likely to eat meat themselves if they're growing these animals at home. That's what these mean. These are 95% confidence intervals. If it excludes 1, it's statistically significant. The further that interval is away from 1, the smaller the p-value, if you wish to think of this in p-values. Okay, so those are animal source foods. If we look at carotenoid-rich fruits and vegetables, the same pattern here. So here's dark green leafy vegetables. The median nationally is 2 times per week, and women are 60% more likely to be consuming those foods if they've grown them. Carrots, 4 times more. But in these percent who are practicing, only 1% of the families grow carrots. So it's important to keep an eye on these percent of the families that are actually growing, and you can see that they're fairly low, but they are there. And so the degree to which they are low represents opportunity for programs. You can see that it's 1 to 4, 2, 3.5 times. If we look at other vegetables, now we know what we're looking at. There's 1.5 to 2.5 times more likely to consume these foods if they're grown at home, and 25 to 50% of the families actually do grow them. But we've also asked about non-essentials, alcohol and snack foods and noodles. Since they don't grow these foods, this is only related to purchasing the foods. 30% purchase alcohol in the past month. 84% to 85% of purchased snacks in the markets, and the median consumption is about 2 times per week for snack foods, which competes with other nutritious foods in the diet. So, to give you a picture is worth 1,000 words, here are the rough percentages of families in the mountains, hills, and the Terai that are growing these foods, producing them, raising them, and you can see, by and large, it's less than 50%. So there's a great deal of opportunity for moving local household homestead production forward. There's a lot of gap to fill, in line with the theme of this meeting. And just a picture of the odds ratios for some of these foods. You can see there, if it's at the line, there's no difference of whether you grow the food or not in terms of eating more for women. But if it's above the line, they're more likely to eat. And you can see there are really substantial gains that are potentially there for growing these foods. A few slides on what households purchase, though, in the markets, since we're concerned with markets. And we can see here that the 4 most frequently purchased foods, the foods that households are most likely to buy in the market, are vegetable oil, snacks, instant noodles, and sugar. Those are the 4 most common. And the foods that they are most likely to spend money on across the markets of in these 3 regions that we've been surveying, those foods fall in the top 10 in terms of the amount of money that they spend. So we need to be concerned about about producing more foods at the local level that can both lead to increased consumption in the home, but also perhaps better equipping the markets as well. So, key messages: women remain undernourished, especially in the Terai. Diets of women are meager in terms of quality. Median intakes are often 0 to 2 times per week for non-staple nutritious foods. 20 to 40% of households raise or grow nutritious foods throughout the year, and if they do, women are more likely to consume those foods. But also, the nutrition transition is happening. Edible oils, snacks, noodles, and sugar are most commonly purchased, and they are among the top most frequently spent on foods as well. In a still largely subsistence economy, I think the political implications are that homestead food production is common but not universal, and where it's not done, this is an opportunity to move forward, as we've seen with our previous speakers. Supporting diverse, small-scale homestead food production may lead to more frequent intakes of these foods by nutritionally at-risk women. So if they grow it, they are more likely to eat it. I'd like to thank USAID and Tufts University, our management partner in Feed the Future, our data collectors at New Era and NTAG, the POSHAN Community Studies investigators, which is growing, and our technical staff, who are absolutely marvelous. And thank you to them. Thank you very much.